Hi, my name is Sienna Ruiz, and I'm here to talk about my thesis, which is called Performing Street Art in Madrid, Artistic Labor and the Cost of Cool. And so I wrote my thesis based off of ethnographic fieldwork that I did last summer in Madrid, where I was really interested in the activist and feminist tradition of public art there. So in 2011, public art was really at the center of the way that the anti-austerity, anti-capitalist movement happened in Madrid, so kind of on the verge of Occupy Wall Street and the Arab Spring. In Madrid, activists occupied the center of the city and demanded basically a extended democratic system and more economic support for the people. And as they occupied and made encampments in the center of the city, there were banners that hung from buildings and posters that decorated these encampments, and public art was really at the center of the way that the world understood this movement and what these activists were saying. And so I was really interested in going to Madrid and kind of seeing how this activism was playing out through public art in the city in the wake of this movement and kind of afterwards. But as I got there, I saw that the state of public art was completely different than what it was in 2011. So I actually saw a lot of what was called street art festivals, which are these huge events put on by beer companies or commerce associations in the city and other organizations, and they're primarily geared towards tourists to visit certain neighborhoods and to see artists making what was called street art in front of them. And you can kind of go and see them do this on a wall or on the window of a building or a business. And I saw that as kind of completely different from the public art that I was kind of originally interested in, which is what led me to my research question, which was how did this kind of inherently anti-capitalist form of public art become converted into value, and what implications did this have for artists' lives and for the areas in which they worked? And so what I learned from artists was that there was kind of this completely new phenomenon going on that was very different from that first public art that I mentioned. And I kind of come to call this phenomenon street art TM, so street art with a trademark, in my thesis. And that's because I wanted a label for what I was seeing, which is a completely commodified form of public art that is funded by various financial interests, including corporations and real estate interests and city government. And I wanted to mark that as something different than the spontaneous forms of graffiti or murals or posters that kind of had this start in the subway trains of New York City or Chicago, that people would go out and spray paint of their own volition and not really make money off of it. Now, street art TM is something that builds off of the signifiers of that history, but is actually something completely different, where people get paid to invoke those aesthetics, but do not make it the ways that it had been made, kind of spontaneously and without that sort of economic drive to do it. And so with that kind of undergirding my thesis, I looked at three things. I looked at how art was being converted into wage labor, so how artists were being paid by these festivals to create art in a different way, in a non-spontaneous form, in a way that just helped them to eat or make rent in different areas of the city that were not the ones that were working in. And I also looked at the link between art and gentrification, so the ways that this form of street art, TM, was preparing and readying neighborhoods for gentrification, and the ways that that's actually rooted in a very deep-seated racism, but made as a package for tourists to consume and feel as if they are engaging with some sort of authentic urban core, when what they're actually doing is looking at a very artificial simulation of urban life. And I also use feminist and creative ethnography to inquire whether it's even possible to kind of revive the transgressive potential of public art. So kind of in the memory of what public art had been in Spain, I look at now what is and whether we can revive that memory in the ways that public art is used today. So I use feminist theory and analyze my own lived experience through autoethnography to inquire what it's like to walk in the modern city and see art that doesn't really reflect who you are, and how we can create art that actually is made by and for marginalized communities. And so this thesis really makes the reader question the art that we see in cities around the world. Street art festivals are taking place in cities from Berlin to Sydney, and we even have our very own street art festival here in St. Louis, which is called Paint Louis. And I would really encourage us to take a second look at the art that decorates our public spaces and ask what stories it tells us about our public spaces and who it's for and what we want them to look like, especially in this moment in history when both the public spaces in Spain and America have been closed down for various reasons. What does the art that we make tell us about who's allowed to be there, about how to open them up, and whether they were ever open in the first place, is what I would really encourage us to think about as we look at the art that's being created, not only in this moment, but also kind of in this wave of preparing cities not for their residents and not for their most vulnerable communities, but for the wealthy visitor and for the tourist class that can bring profit to these cities. And so that is what I hope my thesis inspires in this day and age, and I hope everyone is doing well in their home during this quarantine. Thank you for listening to my video.